From Randy Couture becoming the oldest champ to DC breaking records at the age of 40, here are all the MMA fighters who dominated way past their prime, starting with Michael Bisping.
Michael the Count Bisping!
The Count was in his late 30s and he'd never gotten a UFC title shot. The Brit had gotten into a few title eliminators and fell short every time. Not to mention, he had gone through a number of difficulties in his career. Bisping got brutally knocked out by Dan Henderson at UFC 100, but the worst thing that happened to him was in his fight against Vitor Belfort, who was on TRT at the time and cost Bisping his right eye. Since then, he hasn't been able to see through it and has replaced it with a glass eye. Safe to say, his ability to fight was compromised, and he had to hide his disability in order to be able to compete. It was after the Belfort fight that he managed to rack up a few wins and fight Anderson Silva in his hometown.
Michael Bisping versus Anderson Silva.
Mike won that fight despite eating a brutal knee at the end of the third, which was kind of a cheap shot. But all the effort was worth it in the end, as he was able to jump in on short notice to face Luke Rockhold for the middleweight title. And we all know how that went. The Count became Left Hook Larry that night and avenged his loss against Rockhold as he knocked him out in the first round. After winning the title, he defended it in England against Dan Henderson and avenged that loss too before dropping the belt to GSP. And there's no shame in that. At the time of his retirement, Bisping had the most wins in UFC history and got inducted into the Hall of Fame. This happened because of the accomplishments he had at the tail end of his career. And speaking of getting the belt at the end of your career, Glover Teixeira held the title when he was 42. The former light heavyweight champion had a long career before he got into the UFC, and once he got to the big leagues, fans had high expectations. The Brazilian got a nice win streak before he got a title shot against John Jones, which he lost by unanimous decision. He lost some more after getting a couple of wins and never got close to title contention. It was when he turned 40 that something changed. Glover decided to make one last title run before he called it a career, and it couldn't have come at a perfect time. Jones had left the division, and DC had retired, so the doors were wide open for a new king to make his case for the first time in more than a decade. Glover made the most of that opportunity by getting a 6-fight win streak, 5 of which were brutal finishes. It seemed like there was a fire reignited in him, and he looked just as good as ever. Teixeira got his title shot at the age of 42 against the undisputed champ Jan Blachowicz. The Brazilian dominated the fight and ended up getting a submission in the second round. And we got to witness one of the most wholesome moments in UFC history as Glover was crowned with the UFC Championship at last. Glover then went on to have the fight of the year with Yuri, which he was winning until the final round in which he got finished. Teixeira announced his retirement just a few months ago after losing his title shot against Jamal Hill. The man would go down in the history books as one of the toughest to ever do it. But it's Randy Couture that holds the record for being the oldest champ. Yes, at 42 years, Glover was the oldest man to get the UFC belt for the first time, but Randy's win over Tim Sylvia to get the heavyweight championship at the age of 43 made him the oldest overall UFC champion. He was also the first guy to win a belt in 2 different weight classes. That's right, he's the OG double champ. Couture made his UFC debut in the heavyweight tournament, which he won. He got his hands on gold later that year. Ever since then, he was either holding a belt or in title contention right until the end of his career. Now winning the title at 43 seems very impressive. But Randy held the belt till he was 45. He's also the only guy to compete and win the belt after being inducted into the Hall of Fame, which doesn't really happen until you're right at the end of your career. He also holds the record for being the oldest guy to win a fight inside the UFC at the age of 47. The man defied age and managed managed to beat Father Time on many occasions. He's one of the OGs that everyone has to respect. Now, Randy was the first guy to hold belts in the UFC, but it's one thing to be a champ in 2 weight classes, but to hold both belts simultaneously is a whole other thing. And Daniel Cormier accomplished this as he was about to retire.
That's it. That's it. Daniel Cormier.
The UFC Hall of Famer is widely regarded as one of the best to ever do it. DC started out as a wrestler in high school. Coming out of Louisiana, he was one of the best wrestlers. His success continued through college in the NCAAs, where he got the silver medal. He was also on the US Olympic team twice, so after having such a decorated wrestling career, DC decided to jump into MMA. He was already in his early 30s when he made his UFC debut. Cormier was the ultimate underdog. He was a short guy for the heavyweight classes and didn't have a great physique, but he still managed to ragdoll his opponents with ease. Now, there are many what-ifs about DC's career. What if he fought in an era without Jones or Kane not being his teammate? What if he fought in a smaller weight class? And what if he started fighting at a younger age? DC won his first title in his mid-30s, and he couldn't fight for the heavyweight title in the UFC because of his friend. But as soon as Kane retired, DC decided to move up and challenge for the heavyweight title against the GOAT. And as he turned 40, he became a simultaneous double champ. Cormier was also the first guy to defend his belt in both weight classes. DC went on to beat Derek Lewis after blowing his back out, which is a funny story. On the day of the fight, Daniel sneezed and blew his back. Just goes to show you that he certainly wasn't in his peak condition and was still ragdolling the best fighters in the world. But these are all guys in the big weight classes. This makes Jose Aldo's accomplishments even more impressive. By smaller weight classes, we usually mean up till welterweight, and the older guys can't seem to perform well. The level of athleticism and speed required can't be achieved in their 30s. This is why we see many champions lose a lot of their dominance as they get past 32. But the King of Rio defied all the odds. After losing his belt to McGregor in devastating fashion, Aldo was able to regain his throne before losing to Max Holloway. It was in 2020 that Jose made the decision to move down to bantamweight, which was weird as he previously had trouble getting down to 145, but he figured out the weight cut and his performances in bantamweight were incredible. He got a title shot against Peter Yan, which he lost by TKO, but the UFC Hall of Famer was able to create another win streak to claim a shot at the title. Unfortunately, he lost in an eliminator to Merab and retired afterward. But there haven't been many guys in UFC history who've been able to bounce back as many times as he has. It's a famous saying that an athlete only has one prime, but if there was a guy who could have had multiple primes, it was the featherweight GOAT. Well, that's all we have on MMA fighters that dominated way past their primes.